Hello, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to review the case study assignment, as I know it has a lot of parts and it's worth a significant portion of the final grade, and it's also the first written assignment. So I'd like to go over some of the basic for this assignment, talk about the article, the format for your paper, and then I'd like to focus on the second section, which is the body of the paper, and go over its 4 components, talk about what should be the focus in your response to the assignment questions, and remind you about specific readings in the course that can support your answers. And of course, end reminding you of my contact information if you have any questions. For the case study assignment, you're going to review a newspaper article. This isn't too long, and you're going to write a paper. And in that paper, you're going to analyze the situation in that article. You're going to consider consumer attitudes in that article, ways to change those attitudes, the motivations and motivational conflicts that may also exist. And then you're going to design an ad using the attitude change techniques you mentioned could be used, and the motivational conflicts and theory you thought existed, and put that into your ad and explain how you incorporated that into your ad. So let's look at the paper itself. Remember, you're going to use this article. It's from September of 2017, and it's a short piece from the New York Times. This talks about international tourism in the US. There's a link there. That link is in the assignment details, and you can use that to attach to it in the library. If you have any problems, please send me an email. I'll be glad to send it to you as well. The paper has 3 basic sections to it. After your title page, you're going to have the first section where you're going to offer an introduction, just 1 or 2 paragraphs there talking about the problem in the article, the current situation, and the critical issues of the case. Again, all of that can come straight from the article. In section 2, you're going to do an analysis that will have 4 subsections. You'll answer all of the questions in those subsections and provide support and analysis for all of your recommendations. Your support, and I'll be looking for that throughout, will use high quality academic and business sources. We'll talk about that more. And this, of course, will separate what you'll be offering in this paper, which is expert analysis, from mere opinion and conjecture. The third section will offer a brief conclusion where you'll summarize your main analysis and recommendations and discuss possible ethical and managerial implications. So with that as your basic format, let's look at section 2, which will be the body and the real crux of what we're doing here. So section 2 will be the analysis section. And in the first part of that, you're going to review current attitudes and positioning. In section 2, you'll talk about attitude change methods. And in section 3, you'll talk about motives and motivational conflicts that apply. And then in section 4, you'll use the attitude change techniques you mentioned in section 2 and the motivational and motivational conflict points you mentioned in section 3 to design an ad. And you'll also explain that ad and how it incorporates what you mentioned in section 2 and 3 of the analysis. Before we move forward, I want to remind everyone that the overarching goal of this course is for us to develop your skills around applying, specifically applying consumer research to marketing managerial problems. So remember, one of the most important parts of this paper is bringing in evidence and support, theory, concepts, and models that apply. All right, let's look at each section. The first section is current attitudes and positioning. So the article is about U.S. tourism to the U.S. and how it's being adversely affected. So this section has 3 questions. Remember, you need to specifically address each question. This doesn't need to be done in a question and answer format, but do need to address all 3 questions. And the first question asks you, how would you describe the current attitude of foreign tourists towards the U.S.? Here, based on the article that you're going to read, focus on what might be extrapolated about their current attitudes. The second question asks you to take that attitude apart and describe the cognitive component, the affective component, and the behavioral component, right? Here, again, look into the article, extrapolate what you can, and be sure to note what specifically is the cognitive component, what specifically is the affective component of their attitude, and what is their behavioral component of their attitude. Here, I want to encourage everyone, first of all, remember that attitudes were discussed in the week 4 lecture, and also in the week 4 readings on understanding consumer attitudes, and the week 4 reading on attitudes based on high consumer effort. That was a summary from a Hoyer text. Question 3 asks you, how do you think the U.S. Is currently positioned as a tourist destination in the minds of foreign tourists? Remember that the article itself is offering a particular perspective. I encourage everyone to avoid an all is doomed perspective. The U.S. isn't positioned as a terrible place, but do consider how it is positioned, and be sure to discuss your response in the context of brand positioning. Remember, we discussed a lot about brand positioning in the week 3 reading on positioning the battle for your mind. So, with the attitudes of foreign tourists to the US, and remember, we're focusing only on foreign tourists to the US for this, because that's what the article is about. And in section 1, discussing their attitude and the components of their attitude. Section 2 is the section in which you talk about changing their attitude. Here again, we have 3 questions. Be sure to address all 3 questions. First question is, how could you change this attitude? Here you want to apply general points about attitude change. This goes with the second question, question 1 and 2 really go together. Would you suggest changing the cognitive, affective, or behavioral component? So in terms of how you would change it, just talk about general points about attitude change. And then in terms of your desire, you can focus on wanting to change their cognitive perspective, their affective perspective, their behavioral component, or some combination thereof. Remember that you discussed the cognitive, affective, and behavioral component of their attitudes in the earlier section, so be sure that as you talk about that, you're linking back and it makes, it tracks and is coherent with what you mentioned in section 2.1.2. And here I want to encourage everyone to look at a couple of the Unit 4 readings about consumer attitude change. Remember, there was a reading titled Understanding Consumer Attitudes. There was a reading on attitude formation and change. There's a reading on the summary of attitudes based on high consumer effort that had lots of, in its early part, about attitude change. And there's also a great piece on the influences of personality on the consumer decision process. And if you link to that, you can scroll down to the part there that deals with attitude. I think you'll find lots of good, relevant information about this topic there. Question 3 in this second section asks you to provide specific examples of tactics or arguments that you would use to change the attitude, their attitude. Here, I'm looking for you to discuss specific attitude changes or techniques, change techniques and approaches. And if this is an important section because these are the attitude change techniques or approaches that you're going to use for your ad. This will link to section 4. So be sure to approach this and know that you're going to apply this in your ad. So as you think about changing their attitude or how you're going to do that, note specific ways. Now, again, I want to note a couple of specific readings from week 4, I think, that are valuable here. First, the one about attitude formation and change, and also the readings of the summary of attitudes based on high consumer effort and the summary of attitudes based on low consumer effort. Those readings specifically talked about changing attitudes and based on high or low consumer effort. And so I think you're going to find some really wonderful specific points to include there. Also, there was a great reading on central peripheral routes to advertising effectiveness and the moderating role of involvement. Also good in terms of your approach. So I want to encourage you to bring those readings into your response. And as I go through this, I want to just again remind everyone that everything that you're proposing, as you're proposing, I'm looking for you to cite and reference sources to support what you're proposing. Again, the goal here is to analyze, be able to develop our skills around analyzing a specific problem, taking it apart, understanding it at a theoretical level for consumer research, and then apply techniques that we have in consumer research to develop solutions. Specifically, the solution here is the ad, okay? So, section 1 and 2, section 2 talking about changing their attitude. Section 3 asks you to look into their motives and their motivational conflicts. So you consider them as well as their attitudes in developing the ad that's going to be the response to change their attitudes. Here we have 3 questions again. Be sure that you're addressing all 3 questions. The first question asks, what would be the motives for foreign tourists to visit the US? Here you can, I want to encourage everyone to not just speculate about what their motives are. Remember that there was quite a bit covered in the readings from week 2 about motivational theory, so be sure to dig into those. Especially, there was a reading on the influence of personality on the consumer decision process, and that specifically talked about theories of motivation and what motivates consumers. I think you're going to find that very, very helpful in terms of helping to explain what motivates foreign tourists to visit the US. And also, you can mention some general motives that you might discern from the article. There also is another good reading, I think, has some points that you might use here, and that was for the week 2, and that's the summary of motivation, ability, and opportunity. Question 2 in this section asks, are there any motivational conflicts in visiting the US? Here I want to remind everyone that you have to specifically discuss motivational conflicts, apply the appropriate motivational conflict that you see happening in the situation, and offer explanatory detail about why that's the most appropriate motivational conflict. Remember, we had a discussion board assignment about motivational conflict, and that motivational conflict was specifically discussed in the week 2 lectures. So I'll be looking for that in addressing this. Question 3 asks, what could the US tourism industry do about these motivations and motivational conflicts? Here I encourage everyone to be strategic. Remember that the course material discuss various motivational conflicts and techniques and approaches that marketers could use to address those kinds of motivational conflicts. So here, be sure to consider these and apply them. Again, this part, answering this part, is what you're going to use to develop your ad in the next part of the assignment. So be sure that you are specifically saying what the U.S. tourism industry can do, and be sure to focus. Here, I want to encourage everyone to check out the Unit 2 reading on the summary of motivation, ability, and opportunity, as well as all of the Unit 2 readings on motivation. All right, so in section 1 of the analysis part of the paper, you took apart and examined their motivations. In part 2, you talked about changing their attitudes. In part 3, you looked at their motivations and what can be done to maybe affect those motivations. Part 4, you're going to apply that information, all the theory that you've been using, to develop an ad. Now, part 4 has 2 parts to it, where you're going to create an ad based on the points that you mentioned in section 3 and 4, and you're going to explain that ad. So remember, there are 2 parts here. The first part is to design the ad to create a positive attitude toward the U.S. that would attract foreign tourists. Again, remember, we're talking only about foreign tourists to the United States. Remember, you have to include an actual ad, not just the description of an ad, and that in that ad, I'll be looking for you to incorporate or integrate the specific attitude change techniques and approaches you mentioned in the 3rd question to part 2 of the analysis section, and to incorporate the specific motivational conflict techniques approaches you mentioned in addressing question 3 of the 3rd section of this analysis section. And for the sake of space, you can just take your ad and please place it in the appendix. You do not need to put it there directly in the paper. I'll see it in the appendix. And for this section, you'll then, what you will write is a description of the motives you should use to appeal and the attitude functions that you used in your ad and why these are effective. So here, explain the ways that your ad incorporated and integrated these specific attitude change techniques, and explain the ways you incorporated and integrated the motivational techniques and approaches that you mentioned previously. So as you can see, the sections are sequential. You have section 1, section 2 builds off of that, section 3 builds off of that, section 4 builds off of section 2 and 3. Very important to go in sequence to answer all those questions, and be sure that you're tying it all together with all of the consumer behavior concepts, theories, and models that we've been reviewing. Remember, that's one of the most important things that we're trying to get out of this exercise, is to learn how to integrate all of that. I also want to remind everyone that I am a partner in your learning, so please, if you have any questions, reach out. You can contact me by email, and if it's pressing, please also know that I'm readily available to you by phone. It's never a problem to just pick up the phone and call me. You don't need a special appointment or anything like that. No question is too small. Remember, you're never bothering me, okay? I'm very much looking forward to reading all of your papers, and reach out with any questions. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.